Jeremy Shearmur back here with me. Jeremy, I'm grateful to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
So, at the end of our conversation, we ran out of time, but we wanted to get into some issues concerning toleration and the open society. So, why don't I just start by posing to you broadly, what is the open society
Thanks
as
very
Popper
much.
understood it?
You have raised what seemed to me to be some very interesting issues. I think that Popper has really important things to say about them, not least issues which are particularly pertinent to our current situation. At the same time, I think that in certain respects, he poses issues which seem to me to be very reasonable, but leaves us short in terms of what, if one accepts his views, what institutions this should lead on to. And I think that there are issues in this context relating to toleration, relating to freedom of speech, and also to how we handle issues about pluralism within an open society. Can I start off just by saying a little bit about toleration? Uh, what I've got to say here is bound to be a bit speculative, both in terms of the interpretation of Popper's views, also because while I might at a certain point set out what I take his views to be, even if I've got them right, you might think, well, look, that's surely highly problematic. And the third issue, where things get really wild, as it were, is that I think there are some respects in which there are problems about what he said. And in addition, there are all sorts of things which really call for speculation on our part in terms of how things might work institutionally. So, to make a start on toleration, as I'd understand it, Popper's view, which is really quite striking, is that we are not obliged to tolerate the intolerant. Now,
Yes.
this doesn't, I think, mean that we should be going around suppressing bigots just as such. And I would
Right.
take there to be two aspects to this. I mean, on the one side, if people are intolerant, the key issue from Popper's perspective is, are they willing to countenance rational argument? If they're putting forward particular views, are they open to these being questioned and challenged and so on? And if they are not, then I think there is genuinely a problem there. At the same time, I'd be inclined to say, and I thought that Popper said something about this, but when I was checking up on it, I couldn't find it. It may just be my own inadequacies at dealing with this. But it seems to me that if you have a small group of bigots who are basically not going to do any harm to anyone else, it's not really an issue about pursuing them and forcing them and to be quiet and so on. So it seems to me that on the one side, there is this test about, are they actually open to criticism? And on the other, are they actually of any real significance? Now, if one accepts Popper's broad approach, one first has to ask, well, does it really withstand criticism? And if it does, what does this mean in terms of institutions? For example, if we are not obliged to tolerate people who are intolerant, who gets to make decisions about these sorts of matters? Typically, people might say, well, it's the democratically elected government, or they might say, well, it's the courts that have to do this. But I think it isn't obvious what should, or some people might say, no, it's really a matter of social pressure. But I think that one really needs to have discussion about the pros and cons of doing things in different ways. I also think that there are two important issues to note here. The first is Popper himself insisted that we need to distinguish between people's theories and the people themselves. I mean, he often said a key thing which we need to do within society is to allow bad ideas to die in our stead.
Right.
But it seems to me that if this is going to work, it is important that people are willing to distance themselves from their theories. And this, I would say, in current settings, involves theories about their identity.
I couldn't agree more.
Everything from Popper's perspective is fallible. And this really means that just because we identify with something shouldn't mean that we absolve it from criticism, that we are not willing to listen to anything that might be said which calls it into question. But equally, it seems to me, we need to distinguish criticism of theories and criticism of people.
Yeah.
Popper stressed, really as a key point, that we need to be fallibilists. We need to be aiming at truth. We need to be open to learning from one another. But to be able to do this, our exchanges with them need to be respectful. And I think that an endorsement of ideas about freedom of speech and the importance of criticism and the importance of people being open to criticism carries with it, as it were, on the other side, the notion that if we're engaged with other people, we shouldn't be hurtful towards them or insulting towards them and so on. I mean, who is going to learn from someone who behaves in such a way that one's natural response is to put up a defense against it? Who is going to learn from anyone if they are starting off by insulting you? And I think from this point of view, you can distinguish between criticism of views and approaches and ideas that are built into anyone's idea about their identity, their way of life, or their general views about the world, and putting things in such a way that it really is being nasty towards them. And just purely from the point of view of anyone's ability to learn, I think that not to be nasty and insulting to one another really plays a key role. And it's worth bearing in mind in this context that a lot of ideas, for example, about debating, just don't really fit into such a thing. I mean, what one really needs if one's going to learn from one another is the exploration of different ideas, understanding what they amount to, treating one another as reasonable human beings. Whereas if you stand up and engage in head-on-head debate or debate according to formal rules, it is just going to provoke the other people into not making any concession about anything. No, there may be some reasons for having a debating format. If both parties agree to it, it can be quite a useful teaching device. But just don't be nasty, don't be aggressive, don't be insulting.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that at the moment there is a real risk that when we talk about freedom of speech, and if you consider current exchanges about freedom of speech, then you get, as it were, mistakes being made on either side about this.
Right.
Is it okay if I move on and say a little bit about that?
Well, let me first pick up a few things, and then, I would like to bring up some points about the current landscape that we find ourselves in on the left and right politically. So there does seem to be this tightrope act in this container that you are building out, where critical rationalism flourishes only when we bring humility to the table and respect for the other human as such. Now, you mentioned also that if everything is to be fallible, that includes our identities. And what I find hard, and I see this more on the left, though I'm seeing it also increasingly on the right as well, is an identity-based politics. And if we challenge some kind of identity, it's an attack on their character. And so the left particularly throws their hands up, and they're so afraid of being racist or bigoted or, Islamophobic is a big one right now. And so there's this wall up that prevents this critical discussion of identity based politics. So I don't know if you want to respond.
I'd agree. I would agree, but I think there are a few issues one can raise about that. The first is identities really are best understood as including theories about what those identities are and how one interrelates to other people. And the key thing I would see from a critical rationalist perspective is to stress that there may be elements in how we identify ourselves which are problematic in terms of their consequences. We may be attached to something passionately, but it may include stuff which is problematic or mistaken in ways that we haven't appreciated.
Yeah.
And it will typically be from other people that we can hope to find out about this. But if we're going to do this, it really requires that we each take on board that we are fallible, and that we also approach the discussion in a way that both parties are happy with. I mean, clearly, there may be occasions when the last thing you actually want to engage in is critical discussion with somebody. Why? Well, because you're doing something else. It's also the case that basically, if the other person starts off by making clear that they really intensely dislike you, everything they know about you, they think they have nothing to learn from you, well, you might conceivably take something from an engagement with such a person, but there's no reason whatever why one should put one's approach to people in that kind of way. So a further twist to it is roughly this. I've recently been reading really a rather interesting book about the history of Islam in Europe. And this brought out the degree to which there have been complex interactions between Muslims and people with other sorts of religious identities through the course of European history. The reason that I mention this was just that in some respects, one tends from a kind of current Western perspective to take religion and other things as just being the vehicle for theories. But there is a sense in which, if you look at matters historically, religious attachments were much more like ethnic attachments. And where what you're dealing with is as much a way of life than a bunch of ideas. And what this means, I think, isn't that there should be a proof of a way of life against any kind of engagement, but that it needs to be handled carefully. And that it's not the case that everyone is implicitly engaged in a philosophy seminar or something of this kind.
Right.
Rather, there are ways in which these ideas are manners serving as ways in which people make sense of their lives, their different actions, development, kids, everything on an ongoing basis. And so from that point of view, if one wants to engage really at the level of ideas, it might be necessary to check, first of all, that this is appropriate, that people want to do it, about how it should be done.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. Yeah, so just to step it back a little bit before, because I would like to talk about Islam and just the globalization that we're seeing and how to integrate
Yeah.
Muslim and Western cultures. But before we move there, I want to talk about the personal responsibility that you just outlined in bringing that humility to the table, not attacking the character, and all this individual responsibility that we carry. And in what you just said, you also kind of acknowledged that we can't expect everyone to be a philosopher in a philosophy seminar. There are some people, whether they don't have the capacity, the educational background, the interest to engage critically or in this manner that we're laying out here. And in a open society, multicultural society, as big as somewhere like the United States, we're going to find such varying levels and such a diverse population of people. And so we can't simply rely on each individual to carry that responsibility to engage that way with each other. I think it's appropriate to set up certain incentives that encourage people and establish norms, right? The best that we can to encourage that kind of discussion. But I think that's foolish to think that we can really uh, spread that across the entire population. So the transition there then is, okay, how do we establish this kind of critical rationalism into institutions so that there are protections against the follies that might get the better of humanity without a critical rationalist frame in place.
Okay, can I respond?
Yeah.
I think, first of all, I'd want to say I don't think that this is best looked at primarily just at an individual level.
Right.
Because I think, first of all, that one needs to have some discussion about these issues in terms of what our understanding, say, of free speech should be, and of how it would be reasonable to conduct ourselves. I have in mind, and I was struck as you were talking, by the example, I won't mention their name, but you might recall the way in which members of a tiny Southern Baptist church, I don't mean the Southern Baptists, but they were located in the South, went round and did things like appearing at the funerals of gay people,
Yeah.
and yelling out that the Lord hates them, doing similar kinds of things
Right.
when bodies of people who served in the military were being repatriated to the country and so on.
Right.
And that this was defended as what is really needed to be protected for the sake of free speech. It was also the case a little bit back that there was a parade by, I think, neo-Nazis through a Chicago suburb where there was a significant Jewish population, some of whom had been involved in or who had relatives who'd been involved in the Holocaust. And where it seems to me that what we need to do is to talk about what kinds of conduct and institutions we need separated from these specific incidents, so we don't get into what seems to me to be the very bad situation of people defending such activities because they think that this is what free speech should really be about.
Yeah.
And I think that there are a number of rather complex things in this character. Because on the one side, and I come back to Popper on this, he stressed very strongly that even our best knowledge is fallible.
Yeah.
And he stressed in this context the way in which Einstein was able to offer a criticism of the views of Newton when Newton's views were so well confirmed, they were taken, as it were, as the paradigm of
Right.
established knowledge of a kind that couldn't be called into question.
Right.
And if that is the case, how more so our own particular notions and prejudices? Popper also tended to say, well, in the light of that, he didn't believe in people standing on the basis of their expertise in science as authorities. But it seems to me that we need to be a bit careful about this, because there is a sense in which even our best theories are fallible. It's also the case that there's all kinds of stuff that some people know about, which certainly I don't. And we are all together in this kind of situation. And so we need to prize knowledge of problems. We need to take seriously what people who know a lot about these things can tell us, but at the same time, bear in mind the fallibility of their knowledge.
Yeah.
And this, I think, has some important consequences, because one of Popper's big concerns was to stress the importance of communication rather than self-expression. And so if we're contesting established ideas, we need, in
Dialogue.
part, to make sure that we are communicating with others rather than just asserting things.
Shouting in our echo
But we
chambers.
also need, but we need to get on top of what the problems are in the area, as distinct from just sort of saying things because they seem to be appealing to us. And this can get really rather tricky because I think we're in need of expertise. We're in
Agreed.
need of stuff which we bring to the conversation, which we can typically only get from people who are experts as to what the current state of knowledge is like. Any of this can be called into question, but we need to understand it, and we need to understand its strength before we take it on. And I think that we've moved to a situation now where people really think, well, it is wrong that people are stopped from speaking. Well, yes and no. I think any criticism of views needs to be able to have an outlet. But at the same time, you can ask of a would-be critic, at a certain level, do you actually know what you're talking about? If you're talking about the situation of people, say, who are transsexual, do you actually know anything about this, both at the level of what our current knowledge is concerning these things, but also about people's personal experiences and difficulties? Any element of our existing knowledge can be contested, but if you're dealing with something which is personal to people, you need to go extremely carefully, and they also need to understand, and you need to have had an agreement that you're not just coming in to be nasty to them.
Yeah.
But over and over, we're in this situation where people are apt to say, oh, well, knowledge is fallible, there are differences of opinion. I should have free speech in the sense of being able to voice as loudly as I want and as insensitively as I want any idea that occurs to me, without taking seriously one's own fallibility and one's need to contribute in ways which can lead to an improvement of our current state of knowledge.
Yeah. No, there's a lot to comment on there. I'll start from the beginning. First, I think there's an interesting difference in the U.S. versus British law because we've codified free speech into the Constitution, and I think it provides far more protection here. I don't believe yours is codified. It's just precedent. Is that correct? Judicial precedent?
There are particular pieces of legislation as well. The British situation is typically one of a combination between judicial decisions in particular cases and legislation through Parliament.
Right. I don't know where I stand. I don't know if I quite go as far as you with prohibiting speech that is expressive. I personally don't think it's that useful to just shout your free expressions, but I maybe worry what controlling that speech could lead to. And the next question is who gets to decide what, who's controlling what that speech is? Is it the people, the masses? Is it the legislature? Is it the courts? I don't know. That question is unsettled for me.
I mentioned that before as a problem, and it seems to me that the way to go is initially just to generate public discussion about these issues.
Yeah.
And really to say, look, it is not clear that simply free expression as such, if it doesn't contribute, is really worthwhile.
Yeah.
What do people think about that?
Yeah.
And to discuss it in a situation where that discussion is separated from trying to stop a particular person saying particular kinds of things.
Right.
So I think that we need to have general discussion about this, its purposes and so on, and then to move to those sorts of institutional issues.
Yeah.
And just to get people to debate and discuss what the pros and cons of these different things are like.
Yeah.
But I think we have to get away from the current situation in which, on the one side, people who are maybe deprived of a platform because they are saying certain kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I guess what I would say is that it's fine to deprive people of a platform in the sense of saying that they mustn't come to Granny's funeral, and when the clergyman is saying things over her grave, stand up and say, God doesn't exist, it's all a lot of nonsense. On the other hand, you might well expect that in academic institutions, in particular sorts of forums, you would open up the discussion so that people would be asked to put points pleasantly and respectfully, but really to be able to voice any sensible opinion.
Yeah.
And where you can say to someone, well, you could have the chair do it, for example, in this setting, to say, look, you seem on this simply to be repeating the points that so-and-so has been making, but you haven't said anything about the reasonably detailed criticisms that have been offered in academic journals about those ideas. Unless you are going to address those, and in a way where we can learn something about it, it's not clear that you should be entitled to do any more than repeat the old but criticized stuff.
You're not a serious
the
contributor.
Other side of it.
It's like you're not invited to the conference because you're not taking the discussion seriously.
That's right. Well, that's right. No, it's a question initially of saying, well, should we have rules of this kind? How should they work? And so on.
Yeah.
But equally, it seems to me that those people who currently are complaining that freedom of speech is being suppressed really should be being asked the following. Are you open to criticism of your views?
Yeah.
Are you paying attention to them?
Yeah.
Are you saying it is fine, as it were, that you have the equivalent of a gigantic megaphone through which you can discharge your opinions when other people are not enabled to raise critical points? And again, I think it's a matter of trying to shift some of the discussion away from immediate confrontations to getting them to talk a little bit about these things in rather more abstract terms. Now, it's difficult currently in politics as we have it, because everyone seems to be committed to making everything as confrontational as possible. But I think really that we can ask people on either side of politics to step back a bit from this, to bear in mind their fallibility, the fallibility of everyone, and to face the issue of what institutions and procedures would make best for learning, given, as it were, that however passionately you feel about something, you might, in important respects, be wrong about it, and you might need to learn about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me step back a little bit and pick up on some things you said earlier and just kind of expand the conversation a bit so I can get your response to
Yes,
some of
of
these
course.
issues that I'm seeing presently in our culture. So you talked about just the fundamental idea that all knowledge is fallible, central to Popper's whole framework. Yet we have this background knowledge in all areas. We have specialists, right? And there seems to be this growing contempt for the elite or for the specialist. And everyone is in this age of information is suddenly thinking they are the specialist and they disregard this background knowledge. And again, like you said, I think it's important to remember that our specialists can and will be wrong, but it's also important to remember that they are spending their entire careers getting their hands dirty exploring these subjects. So it's important that we start with what frameworks they have and we can chip away piecemeal at what they have presented to us. So I see this amplified in the world of podcasting. You have big podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience, where he invites people on that pretend to have some kind of specialty or knowledge, and he gives them a platform for 2 to 4 hours. And this misinformation suddenly is spread to millions of people. So I I think we're actually in a moment of history where we need to move back towards respecting the specialist or the elites, and find a little bit more humility in ourself and our own knowledge. Um, I don't know if you have
Like,
anything to.
could I respond briefly?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Well, yeah, I think there are two or three issues there. I mean, first of all, there is a certain irony of your raising this problem in the context of a podcast
Of a
because
podcast,
the
exactly.
development of podcasts has, in a certain sense, represented an important step in the fragmentation of the public sphere. So that
Yeah,
when you had, I mean, it used to be the case that there were few things to hear or see, and
right.
people would gather round a water cooler or go out having cigarettes at the time when
Yeah,
that's,
yeah.
and would exchange about these things.
Hmm.
It was also the case that there were equal time regulations which required that different perspectives were represented. Now,
Yeah,
it seems to me that you can't, as it were, put everything back into the bottle, as it were.
sure.
It's gone, but that we need really to give some serious thought to what kind of institutions will allow for good criticism. And
Yeah,
what is striking about this is that you do get in a few settings some quite good uh, creations of ways in which people can make responses to things. And for example, the New York Times typically allows for uh, written responses to opinion pieces and sometimes also to news stories. And there, typically, the quality is quite good. In other
yeah,
cases where there has been an attempt to do this, The Economist used to, The Economist magazine. But you tended to get abuse of that by people who were trying to uh, do commercial plugs for things or just introducing abuse and so on. And it was really
Right.
quite costly and tricky. But it does seem to me that working on those examples where these things actually operate reasonably effectively, one might be able to build on them in terms of podcasts, in terms of various other exchanges of information, so that people could actually make and be encouraged to make serious responses, but also put in links to where critical discussion of those perspectives can be found. And
Yeah.
so I think that the issues that you raised are really very serious. There is another kind of issue that you raised, which is issues about respect for specialists. And I think what is really tricky is that I think a central problem facing us is to come to accept and then think in institutional terms about fallible expert knowledge. And what I have in mind here is that you either get to a situation where people just dismiss experts, say, oh, I can research this for myself on the internet and come up. I mean, there's nothing I think that makes one's heart sink more than someone who comes up to you and said, oh, I've researched that for myself on the internet, typically meaning they found something that fits in with their prejudices, and at that
Yeah.
point they stop. But it is a difficult matter, not least because of two or three things. I mean, on the one side, you have issues like, for example, those that came up in relation to COVID, where you want at one level free and open, sensible discussion, but at another level, you do expect the government to have to take certain decisions as to what is to
Yeah.
be done and to get involved in complicated trade-offs, and sometimes ones
Yeah.
which people are unhappy talking about. For
Right.
example, about the cost of a human life, or how do you trade off the well-being of the economy with the fact that if you open up the economy, more people are likely to die. And
Yeah.
it is very tricky, just because if you are a politician and you were asked about this, it would be all too easy to say things which could then be used in the hustings or in newspaper headlines
Yeah.
against you
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
ways that just lead you to behave a bit like potential members of the Supreme Court who try and pretend that they never had an opinion about anything controversial. So it is difficult, but we need, I think, really to talk about some of these problems in slightly abstract ways, and to talk about, okay, how are we implicitly tackling these things at the moment, and how could this be improved? But you can also set up other forums for more speculative engagement. Another kind of problem in the background to all of this relates to issues to do with social and intellectual pluralism. And one of the striking things about Popper was that he emphasized the idea of an open society and criticism, but also he stressed the significance of pluralism. And this, I think,
Before we move
arises
on to
in
the
three particular
pluralism,
ways.
sorry, before we shift into pluralism, can I just pick up on one more issue that you raised that touches on the free speech,
Yes, of
like at
course.
the graveyard, and um, there's this, there's this, at least in the U.S. I don't know how it is in Britain, but um, this idea of free speech absolutism is kind of a fad again. It, people like Elon Musk that's championing this idea, and they even think it has some kind of precedent here in the United States, but I think it's often confused that free speech means you can say whatever you want wherever you are at any time, but without any kind of consequences. And that's just not true, nor is it, I believe, a society we would want to live in. So, for example, if you're a store owner and you have someone come into your store and saying obscene things that are making your customers feel uncomfortable, well, kick the person out. There's no problem with that. They don't have the freedom to say whatever they want in someone's private establishment, right? So I think that is often confused. There's a freedom for the owner to say, "Get out of my house, get out of my establishment." I see a parallel there with the graveyard. I feel like at a funeral, that should be one of those spaces. You should be able to say, "Hey, this is a private gathering. You are not allowed to bring your free expression here." So I don't know. Yeah, if you have any replies to
Well,
that.
I think that that's right. Although I am no expert on American law, but my understanding is that there has been a lot of controversy concerning what counts as public space. And
Yeah.
this includes whether a shopping mall counts, whether an airport counts, and so on.
Or even
So
social
you
media.
have these discussions. Yeah, but I think that what one needs to do in this context is to have explicit discussion about, as it were, what the point of free speech is in
Yeah.
different areas and settings.
Yeah.
And then if you're concerned with issues about shopping malls, someone's store, or whatever, where one needs to have an engagement between people who are specialists in the law of property and people who are engaged in with these things at the level of what the point in different settings of different kinds of free speech might be. Just because you're going to be in a situation where what you can do in terms of resolving one lot of problems has to interrelate to what you do in terms of the other sorts of problems and the law that's been or just informal practices that have been developed in relation to that. But again, I would be inclined to say, look, what's necessary is to have public discussion, but ideally removed from particular controversial cases, so that people can approach these problems in ways where they're not too excited about them.
Yeah.
There is, though, a further kind of issue which just relates to freedom of expression and freedom to demonstrate and things of this sort, where, I mean, at a certain level, you might say to people, well, couldn't we now give you a certain kind of freedom of expression so that you can indicate what you think, for example, about the current Iran war, simply by pressing a button on your phone or computer?
Yeah.
Now, that would certainly give people a certain freedom of expression. More is involved if people are going on a demonstration. But I think one needs to talk a little bit about, well, what is involved and in what circumstances this is best realized by this means or that. So I would see these matters as being ones which at every level require a kind of interplay between the different strands that are involved, but particularly that it should happen outside of contexts in which people are getting really upset about particular examples.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about pluralism? Because
Yeah,
our time is getting on.
I'll leave that up to you. I was going to say, yeah, let's move on to our final topic, which is pluralism, which I think is crucial to everything we've touched on. Without pluralism, critical rationalism doesn't exist. The open society doesn't exist. The growth of knowledge doesn't exist. Evolution, life. It's just this idea of plurality is central to the growth of knowledge. So, yeah, I would love to if you're
Well,
willing.
I
And
would, yes, certainly. But I guess I would say several different things about it. I mean, first of all, a key issue that Popper raised is the way in which, because of our fallibility, we need to be able to learn from people in different traditions, both intellectual and social. And if that is going to happen, it seems to me that we need to have protection in some sense for those different traditions so that they can flourish and develop, but also to have certain kinds of fora in which there can be meeting and exchanges between them.
Yeah,
They
that
come
is
back to
so crucial because we are, as we become more globalized, especially as you go to different cities around the world, you're almost seeing this melting pot where every city looks the same. So we are losing many cultures around the world. So we're not preserving this diversity or multiplicity of cultures. I think that was a great point you raised.
well,
Go ahead.
that's right. But there are different elements to that. I mean, clearly, one element to it is that, I mean, there are different ways of living. I mean, in the sense of making a living, which typically bring with them needs to develop different sorts of cultures. And where one problem is that we often now are finding people who have grown up in one sort of setting being put next to people who have grown up in a different sort of setting. And one might say, for example, I mean, let me give you an extreme example of this. Take the issue posed by the Taliban in Afghanistan, where their particular and in many respects very one-eyed religious views, and I say very one-eyed because the interpretation of their traditions and aspects of Islam that they are taking are ones which really wouldn't be accepted even by scholars who are themselves traditionalists in many respects in the same kind of school. And so there is something that is very distinctive there, but also you have to talk about what kind of societies are people living in, what different ways of life are really open to them, and there is a risk that as liberals, we have ideas about individual dignity and rights, which I think are really very important, but there is the danger that we are apt to try to impose them on everybody else and to use some of our own strengths, I mean, either armaments or wealth, to essentially try and intimidate other people into adopting what we think is right without actually appreciating their situation and listening to them. Now, this is an extreme situation. I know very little about Afghanistan and so can't give good judgments. But there is a risk that we do this kind of thing even within our own society, and that we are basically intolerant of views in settings where other people can perfectly cogently hold them. Now, what do I have in mind? And again, one can turn to Popper. And there are two things that are worth mentioning in this context. First of all, there are certain limitations about to rational argument and exchange. It simply isn't likely to be the case, not least because much more is involved than just intellectual doctrines, that you're going to persuade people to shift out of traditions in which they grew up, out of religious or metaphysical ideas with which they identify. And in that kinds of context, you may find that while over time there will be various kinds of adjustments, that some people in one's own society just have different views about fundamental matters. And it seems to me that a key problem facing us as a society is, how do we allow for learning and interchange without the intimidation of people who haven't been convinced by way of rational argument that there are problems in their own ideas. And one might think in this context about ideas concerning multiculturalism. And you mentioned Islam a bit earlier. It's quite interesting that in many respects, it's actually been some Muslim societies which have got closer to ideals about this than have many Western societies. I mean, there is a sense in which, for example, it certainly is the case that the so-called millet doctrine, which was developed from Muslim ideas within the Ottoman Empire, provided a way of dealing with different religious and cultural communities where, under the sway of a Muslim rule, you had a good deal of self-government with regard to religious and cultural matters by way of various different religious come ethnic groups. Now, it wasn't ideal, and one might say, well, what were the problems? And one of them was that you had a particular substantive perspective, a particular Muslim perspective in the position of ruling. Whereas what you might say is, well, what you want are rules of an open society in which there is a kind of negotiation about what the common rules for living together and learning need to be, which is different from any substantive lot of rules that people are living by. Now, I don't know what this would amount to, but it is tricky, but interesting, and at least I think it's worth discussing. There is, though, another side to this, which is that Popper, in his work, talked about what he called metaphysical research programs. And these were ideas about the constitution of the world, about how science might develop. You could think of them as being a bit like Kuhnian paradigms, where a paradigm could be a view about the world, but also something which basically told people what kind of explanation to look for, in what sort of way should science be developed. But Popper's view is, as distinct from Kuhn's, that you don't just have a monism of these things, but that you can quite properly have a pluralism on a competing basis.
Yeah.
But where it seems to me that if you do this, you can ask people who favor a particular view to spell out their view and to spell out what the problems and issues are that are facing it. A conversation about that is something which people who take other views can perfectly reasonably join in with as well. Now, if you
So let
accept
me make that
that,
a little more can I
then
make
it
that a little
seems,
more concrete? So for
yes,
example, let's say we're looking at some kind of human experience or condition, and let's say we have a paradigm that's operating in some kind of mystical framework. And then we have one that's operating in a therapeutical or psychological framework. And then we have one operating in some medical framework or physical framework, scientific framework. Now, these all may be pointing at the same thing, but we're just viewing it from and in a different paradigm. And so there's this pluralism of insights into this thing, and we can bring each to the table and discuss rationally the problems or issues involved. Am I hearing you correctly with
well,
that?
of each perspective, but where you could first of all ask people who favor a particular view, well, why does this seem to you to be compelling? If you take that sort of view, how in principle do you think we should set about understanding phenomena in this area? You can then
Okay.
further ask these people, well, how can we set about appraising this? Because some other people have got different views. And
Okay.
you can also ask, well, does it lead to useful empirical work in which, as it were, the power of this approach is shown? You can have these different things put on the table, and first of all, you can have people who take other views joining in the discussion, so that people
Right.
who take a different view about something might say, well, wait a minute, you have suggested that these phenomena should be understood in the following way. But if that is the case, what about such and such, which seems on the face of it clinically to be very similar to what you are talking about? Are you committed to saying that that should be explained in a similar kind of way? And so one
Right.
would get the articulation of these different views, and then one could at any point just ask people, okay, you know, set out what your problematic is and how, also explain how you're getting on. And to give a
Yeah.
concrete example of this sort of thing, I did some work a bit back on the ideas of so-called intelligent design, which, to
Okay.
put it bluntly, is a kind of something close to a creationist perspective on the world, but with which is rather fuzzy on the identity of the creator. And the
Sure.
argument that I offered in this stuff, I explained why people took it up and so on, but said, look, um, you are facing, it seems to me, the following difficulty with your programmatic views. That if you look, say, at the work of Behe, who is a significant player in this, he wanted to claim that there were certain design-like features in to be found in nature where it wasn't clear how you could tell a story about their evolution. Now, this is an interesting point, and it's a challenge. But equally, one could say to him, but you seem to be offering us a picture in which much takes place by way of evolution, but there seem to be various pretty much arbitrary looking design-like
Right.
features scattered in it. Can you explain roughly how we make
How?
sense of this?
Right.
But equally, you can say to people who take this view, okay, we understand where you're coming from, but if we get rid of an evolutionary approach within biology, you have in principle a huge amount of material which you then need to be able to offer scientific explanations of in terms compatible with your approach. How are you going to do that? And this doesn't rule out their view, but if that criticism is right, it says in effect that they're problematic if they're attracted to that view, looks a bit different from what they've been taking it to be, and where if someone wants rationally to pursue that, they have a massive task on their hands. But you could do similar kinds of things in different areas for different aspects of science or views about humanity or the world.
Sure.
You can argue in principle for how we should be understanding various phenomena. But there is then the issue, well, can you offer detailed explanations compatible with that approach that you've set out? And in particular, if you're coming into the field and saying, we want to supplant this other view which offered those explanations, then on the face of it, you are committing yourselves to the task of being able to replace that detailed stuff. And it's just that this, in that particular case, might then seem to be a pretty daunting task. But one could apply this kind of approach across the board to different politically inspired approaches to policy, to our ideas about how we make sense of the universe and our place in it, and so on. And I think that everyone faces difficult problems.
Yeah. So I think this is what you're saying. Tell me if I'm wrong, but we want people to be able to come in. So say we've entered grad school and there's a predominant idea about a particular subject in biology or in neuroscience or whatever it may be. And you come in with this new idea and you're climbing a mountain because there's already this established idea and you're working on instinct or a little inkling or just a burgeoning idea. And I don't think we want to suppress those and say, hey, like, you need to come in and explain yourself immediately and why all these little problems are unsolved here. You need to explain them or we're not going to take you seriously. I don't think that's the kind of container we want to create in academics and politics or really in anything. I think we want to create space for this multiplicity of ideas to be able to be developed before they're just crushed by the traditional or existing mainstream theory.
Well, I want to go a bit beyond that in the following terms. I doubt if a single individual is going to be able to handle this very well. But can I tell you a story to illustrate what might be done? I studied at the London School of Economics, and I studied in philosophy, but also political science. And the philosophy department was very much dominated by, I mean, not in any way uncritically, but the kind of approach associated with Karl Popper. The political theorists, on the other hand, were very much influenced by the ideas of Michael Oakeshott, who was a conservative theorist very much in the British Hegelian tradition. And what one found was that the two departments, I mean, not everyone in them shared these particular perspectives, but where they had a central role, and this worked extremely creatively because there were enough people in each case who were interested in these different approaches to be able to develop them but also to raise, particularly in the Popper case, criticisms and issues about them. And it seems to me that what
Right.
one needs to think of is the possibility of a multiplicity of institutional exemplifications of different programmatic ideas, but also to build in the possibilities for critical exchanges between them, but not, as it were, in too intrusive a way. Because you were saying you needed space for the individual who has distinctive ideas not to be crushed. Well, I would be inclined to say what you need is for enough people who are interested in a particular approach to be able to pursue it in a particular institutional setting, but also in certain contexts to face external criticism of that, but not all the time. But that goes then beyond the institutions to talking about how journals will work, promotion works, and financing works. And one is led in this context, I think, to an interplay between critical rationalism and its pluralism and the normative sociology of knowledge of a kind that Popper himself was possibly reasonably justly rather leery about.
Yeah. All right. Well, one more question for you if
Of
you call
course.
it. I'm just curious how you see the future of education moving forward with AI and also considering the economic landscape in front of us where it appears many jobs will be outsourced to AI. So what is this shift in education going to look like? What should it look like? What if we're parents and have young children? Um, how do we want to be thinking about their future and setting them up to be successful?
Well, let me respond programmatically and rather quickly. I think that large language models, particularly, can play a very useful role, uh, even as they stand. I mean, one needs to convince people about how to use them and what their strengths and weaknesses are. I think it would be very good if people, if they are interested in something, articulate a few ideas and then check them against a large language model
Yeah.
rather than checking them against social media. So I would say if I were world dictator, I would abolish social media other than, kind of exchanges between friends and pictures of cats and things of this kind. And for information, go to the large language models. On the other hand, you need, I think, to get people trained in what they can do, but also to develop a kind of meta level culture of reporting on what they've been able to achieve using them so that
Mm.
other people can use that as models in other areas.
Yeah.
And I also think that this and interaction with this stuff positively should play a really important role in all levels of education. People need to be trained in this rather than just doing a lot of dumb things. Now, in terms of education as such, a preoccupation of mine has been that I think that there has been a completely mistaken expansion of universities to embrace a greater and greater proportion of the population. I think it's been something a bit like a cargo cult. I mean, namely that people saw that people who came from a certain educational background got attractive and interesting jobs.
Yeah.
They didn't really pay attention to the structural constraints on how many such jobs there were,
Right.
or to really the degree to which a lot of the skills that people were acquiring required, on the one side, certain kind of capacities, but also the ability to go into those sorts of jobs. And it's been, as it were, a little bit like the South Pacific imitation of the landings where goods were discharged from aeroplanes, and they thought that during the war period, and they thought that if they did something similar, they would get the gods giving them the goods. And I think that the model that's been used has been a very bad one, and that what one needs is to have resources put instead into equipping people on an ongoing basis for things which will actually meet ongoing needs in the job market, together with, I mean, education in general principles of how different particular spheres operate, as actually used to be common in the Scottish university system, together also with technical training where it's needed. And then clearly there will also be a market, but a very restricted market, for the people who'll be doing that sort of instruction. But I think that we've been sold a pup, and where certainly in Scotland, the situation is that there are too many people who didn't have any special ability for it, acquiring degrees in the humanities and some of the social sciences, where this leads to nothing other than debt, and where on the other side of it, all sorts of things that are desperately needed, such as plumbers, electricians, people who can build houses, and there are a whole bunch of other such things which aren't currently quickly going to be replaced, just crying out for people who got the appropriate skills and training.
Right.
But end of that particular sermon, as it were.
Well, all right. Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Take care.